Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Wordfence Live. You've heard the recent stories of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, the JBS meat processor ransomware attack, and many other high-profile intrusions that have been in the news as of late. Now, the probability of a ransomware attack hitting your WordPress site may be low, though the probability of an attack on your site is not. The question is, do you know what you would do if your site fell victim today, or how you would handle the breach? Could you get your site back up and functioning before anyone ever knew? Stay tuned. You're about to find out. We'll be right back to get started. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Wordfence Live. My name is Scott Miller. I'm a customer support engineer here at Wordfence. Today is June 8th, and we saw a rather major internet outage affecting major sites like Reddit, CNN, the New York Times, and others. This incident was attributed to an outage at Fastly, a CDN used by these websites. At the time of this broadcast, we're unsure of what incident occurred at Fastly. However, it underscores the importance of what we're going to talk about today, and that is incident response planning. The last thing anybody running a major site wants to see is being in position 1 on down detector. Is there a way that these services could have recovered faster if they had adequate incident response planning? It's possible, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later here. Today, we're going to talk about incident response planning as it relates to security and your WordPress websites. And we say it all the time here, security is never 100%, but you can make it appear that you're operating at 100% security with effective incident response planning. Nobody wants to be hacked, but what makes it worse with an intrusion on your systems is running as the lead story on the news. And, again, we've seen it quite a few times lately. Effective incident response planning can be the key to recovering quickly, and ideally that happens before anyone knows that there was an intrusion. Now, of course, a quick recovery isn't going to absolve you from legal requirements to disclose the breaches and the issues that you've run into, or maybe information that was taken along the way, but it can help your business recover to ensure that your operations aren't affected. The key here, again, is to recover as quickly as possible. And as I mentioned, that does not mean hiding the issue or the breach that may have taken place. These cases, when these happen, they need to be transparent. We've seen them in the news, the information that comes out afterwards. It needs to happen like that. And, by the time the disclosure comes around for these large issues and these vulnerabilities and the breaches, you should be up and running and fully recovered by that point. So today, we're going to take a look at the basics, and then we're going to go in depth with some different phases that you should be prepared for your site in the event that it's the target of an attack. Remember to hit the like button here below the video, as well as the subscribe and bell buttons. You'll then be notified when we go live. That is every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. Let's get started by bringing in our threat analysts here on Wordfence Live, Ram Gall and Chloe Chamberlain. Ram, how's it going over there?
It is very hot in Arizona now, and I don't go outside during the day because the day star is basically going to beat me into the pavement.
Yeah, definitely warming up. What's it like there, Chloe? You're on the road by the looks of it, huh?
Yeah, I'm still in Maine, and we're about to pack up actually tomorrow and go to New York for a couple nights, and then go to Michigan, and then all the way over to Colorado. So things are good, but it is scorching hot here too, and I am not enjoying it at all.
Well,
No
we'll
escape.
catch you. We'll catch you in a new location, I suspect, next Tuesday when we go live. And we're going to define the conversation here in just a moment. We're going to talk about some phases that you need to be familiar with regards to incident response. But first, let's talk about a different phase. This is our live viewers' potential favorite phase, and that's the swag phase. So let's throw our question out there. You're going to see a form. You're going to be able to click on the form and submit your answer. And I believe our question is, what could be classified as a security incident? And we're going to talk about that and more in just a moment here. So when you see the link, go ahead and fill that out. The first 5 correct answers will be you'll get an email from us, and we'll let you know that you've won. And if you would like to send any pictures in, if you have any animals that are wearing the swag that we send, we always appreciate that. It's always fun to see. So let's get started here. Ram, what is incident response? What are we talking about here today?
Well, incident response is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's actually an entire discipline. It's the process of responding to incidents and basically figuring out the best way to handle them. And today we are primarily talking about security incidents, but not all incidents are security related. And honestly, the process is often very similar to both security and non-security related incidents, because even non-security incidents are still primarily going to impact availability. So it's important to have an incident response plan in place so that when a security incident happens or a non-security incident happens, you and your team knows exactly how to react in order to have minimal impact on your business and, in this case, on your WordPress site. And this doesn't mean hiding that an incident occurred, but the idea is to deal with it fast enough and thoroughly enough that by the time you disclose, everything's already back to normal. So that it doesn't impact your ongoing operations, so that it minimizes impact to, how your customers perceive you, to your search engine rankings, all of that. It's much better to have a blog post of, hey, here's what happened, and maybe send out a few emails about what happened, than it is to have an ongoing outage with everyone wondering, hey, why is it still down? So, but I mean, even with incident response, incidents will happen because security is never 100% right. Right, Chloe?
Yep. So security is never 100%, which is why you need to have an incident response plan in place. So you might be wondering, why are we talking about incident response today? My site is super secure. I follow everything from A to Z. I have strong passwords. I'm using Wordfence to protect my site. I implement hardening. My host is secure. But security is never going to be 100%. It might be like 99.9. It might be 98%. But the thing with security is, things change constantly. New vulnerabilities are discovered that, we didn't know about before and have protection against before. New things are constantly discovered in security. And that's why, it's never going to be 100% to some degree. And so what you're doing when you're securing systems and resources and such is you're trying to get your risk down to an acceptable level. So, what your organization deems is acceptable. So you're using all strong passwords, yada, yada. But, there's this one thing that might have a chance of getting compromised, but, it would cost significantly more to protect it than it would be to trigger an incident response or something like that. So why we're talking about incident response planning is so when one of those incidents happens, you will be able to react appropriately, and do so quickly and with as little impact to your customers as possible. So, if you see someone with administrator access log into the site, and you detect that immediately and you can resolve that within 5 minutes of it happening, then your customers are going to have such there's not that potential for that attacker to get in and find personally identifiable information and those kinds of things. So it's important that you have incident response plans in place so that you can trigger the incident response as soon as something's detected. And so that brings me into what's classified as a security incident. And this can be anything that impacts the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of resource, or in your case is probably a WordPress site. So confidentiality is protecting, the confidentiality of information. So basically making sure that information isn't shown to unauthorized users. So for example, personally identifiable information, making sure that that isn't making sure that an attacker can't access that information. And then you have integrity, which is making sure that data isn't modified. So, your options being updated in the database or things like that. And then availability is making sure that your site remains online. And so it's not taken offline by a DDoS attack or, a malicious file that, takes it offline and defaces it, those kinds of things. So Some examples of security incidents might be anywhere from a malicious file being detected to a plugin or a plugin with a vulnerability being detected. It could be a developer accidentally typoing on a production server and taking it offline, even though hopefully you have protections in place for that not to happen. It could be an employee sharing sensitive data to an external party and figuring out from that external party. There's so many different security incidents that there could be, and it's actually important for you as an organization to sit down and determine what is going to be a security incident and what is a security incident to your company. So that's something important to keep in mind when figuring out what security incidents are. So
One good
now we're
thing there in what you covered is Wordfence can give you a hand with some of those things. If you're seeing something in your scan, maybe there's a backdoor that's been found. If you're checking live traffic constantly, you might be seeing a DDoS attack there, modified files right in your system, maybe a plugin file that has changed there. So it's a good start having that set up, and that's kind of the first step here. But we're going to look at a number of different frameworks here for our phases, right, Ram?
Yes, we are. And there's a number of different incident response frameworks. Depending on who you ask, they tend to have anywhere from 4 to 6 phases. But we're going to be using the SANS model today, which has 6 phases. And realistically, it's almost identical to the NIST model, which has 4. It's just that the NIST model clumps some of those phases into a single phase. But we like having a little more granularity. So let's start with the first phase. Now, the first phase that's important is preparation. And actually, the first phase that's important is caffeination. Hold on. That
Always
is actually
the most important step.
This is actually a critical phase in any incident response, in all phases of every incident response. By the way, you will need a lot of caffeine to keep going. But yes, preparation. So planning ensures that minimal downtime and impact affect your organization. And it's an important step in the incident response plan, so you and your team know exactly how to react in the event of a security incident or a non-security incident. And this also means making sure you have the right equipment in place, making sure you have the right processes in place, and being ready to go in the event of an incident. So here's the thing. We can't really offer you any ready-to-go plans because every organization is different. So the way you build an incident response plan is by asking questions. Questions about your organization and questions about how you want your organization to handle an incident. And we've sort of mostly broken this down into who, what, where, when, and how questions and a few others. So let's start with the who. And, this is one of the big ones. It's who are you going to call? I mean, not the Ghostbusters, obviously. But, having an on-call rotation is really important. Knowing who the point of contact is, knowing who's going to be the initial person alerted to something that might be going wrong, but also knowing who they need to call is critical. And, who's going to communicate information about the incident to stakeholders. And I mean, when I say stakeholders, I mean, if your company's employees need to know that there's an outage, or, if the media needs to know that there's been a breach, who's going to communicate that? And another question to ask is who has access to the necessary systems? If your main developer has gone AWOL and no one else has, the SSH key to get onto the server, that could be a very big problem. So the who is a really important question to ask. Next, you want to do what? You want to ask what? What assets are considered the most critical? What assets are basically business continuity assets? What can't your business go on without? But it's also important to ask what's normal for your organization. And we'll get into baselining later. Chloe will cover that. But it's really important to know what constitutes normal operations and what constitutes not normal. It's also important to ask what could go wrong with the plan. And here we basically tabletop exercises are one of the most important things you can do, and that's basically playing D&D but for disasters. But yeah, it's basically doing exercises to figure out what could possibly go wrong. Another question you want to ask is where. Where are your backups? Are they in multiple redundant offsite locations? And have you tested restoring them to make sure they're valid and can be restored in a reasonable amount of time?
That's something we've touched on multiple times here on live, right, Ram? Having backups in multiple places, ideally off-site, and testing backups, which I don't think a lot of people do, right?
Yeah.
Or
yeah,
maybe not enough.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Having your backups on site on your actual server, that's all well and good in case of, a configuration issue. But if someone compromises the server, that means you can't trust those backups. And if you only have your backups with your hosting provider and your hosting provider gets, say, ransomwared, then, your site might be okay, but you might not be able to access those backups at all. So, have them in a bunch of different places. And another thing to ask is when. And that's when should an incident be considered critical enough that it gets escalated, and how far should it get escalated? You might not want to wake up your lead developer at 2 a.m. for just an attack unless you've confirmed that the attack is causing availability issues. You probably don't want to wake up your CEO at 2 a.m. unless, there's actually going to be a business continuity impact if something's actually threatening the future of your company. It's also really important to ask at what points during the incident will the ongoing status be communicated, and to whom? If there is a breach, when are you going to communicate that to your customers? So when's a super important question to ask. How? How is sort of the last of the official 5 questions, and that's, how are you going to detect and respond to different types of threats? And I mean, don't just have an incident response plan, also have, ideas of what you're going to do for different types of situations. You're probably going to have a slightly different plan for one type of security incident versus a configuration issue. And there's also other questions you need to ask. How are the people responding to the incident going to keep in touch? And this is actually a big one. Are you going to set up a bridge call or a conference call? What if that goes down? Will you use TeamSpeak? Will you set up a Slack channel or a Discord? Are there redundant communication methods in case one of them falls through? And this is, again, a place where tabletop exercises can be super useful. And here we're going to sort of go off the official structure, but into stuff that's really important, which is, how long will it take to resume operations if your entire production infrastructure gets completely wiped or encrypted? Say like, Colonial Pipeline, let's say that all of your production servers, are destroyed. One concept to be aware of is the idea of a hot site versus a warm site versus a cold site. So a hot site is basically a backup location or a set of infrastructure where if your main, site, and that could be website in, WordPress case, though, in the case of some organizations, it might be an actual office space. But a hot site is basically something where you can basically restore or fail over to it within minutes. A warm site is similar, only it's something where you might have a few hours of downtime before you can get everything back up. And the classic example is if your company has offices in a place prone to tornadoes, you might, pay a small amount to rent a backup facility that your employees can drive to that's away from the tornado to work at. In the case of, WordPress site, it's probably going to be more like, can you restore known clean backups to a newly provisioned clean server or a new instance and point your DNS or load balancer to that within a few hours? Cloud computing makes this, cloud providers make this way easier. Like, in some cases, it even does it automatically for you, which is pretty rad. But
now, a hot site, of course, is going to be the most expensive option there, and that's going to be less common to see.
Yeah, most companies are not going to be able to or really need to afford a hot site. I mean, that's mostly like critical infrastructure. But warm sites are, honestly, in the past, they weren't affordable for any but the biggest organizations. But, the cloud hosting really has made warm sites a lot more viable for smaller organizations, especially remote organizations. So, it might not be a bad idea to look into that. Just have a process in place where you can spin up a fresh instance from a known clean backup and have everything pointed over to it in a few hours. And then there's cold sites. And, this is the sort of traditional, okay, we have to retrieve the backup tapes from Iron Mountain and wait a few days and then like read them into the tape reader to get everything back online. And you know, this is from what I gather, this is kind of how Colonial Pipeline was set up, and it's not a great way to do things if you're critical infrastructure, but it's still better than nothing. But you know, be aware of these concepts.
It sounds like we're coming to the phase where you're gonna potentially identify the issue, right, Ram?
Yeah, I want to cover a few things real quick first, though, and that's, you know, this is probably not going to be relevant for WordPress sites, but in any incident response, preserving human life is the absolute #1 priority. And, you know, just on the off chance that it actually applies to you, bear that in mind. And the other thing is make sure to run fire drills on all of these to make sure they work, or else your incident response plan is going to be tested only when there's an actual incident. And then you're going to find out all sorts of cool things about your organization that you might have wanted to know earlier. Anyways, let's go into phase 2, identification. Chloe?
Yes, so this is a really important phase. This is actually identifying that there's been a security incident. And so this is really important because time is of the essence. You want to identify these problems before, you know, it's become a huge problem. So you want to make sure that you're finding incidents, you're identifying when incidents are happening, like within, you know, an acceptable amount of time where there's not going to be as significant of an impact. Like I was previously saying, if an attacker logs in, you should be able to detect that in like 5 minutes, if not quicker, so that you can revoke that access immediately, so that that situation isn't escalated. And one of the things Ram mentioned is baselining. So an important aspect to this phase is that you should have a baseline already established so that you can know when things are not normal. So if, you know, an average WordPress site gets 100 attacks per minute, and you don't know that this is normal, this could be pretty alarming. But if you have that baseline where you know that 100 attacks per minute is pretty normal, then you know that if you see that, then there's nothing to worry about. There's no security incident. But if you see, you know, maybe 500, then you would want to trigger your incident response plan and, you know, take all those appropriate actions. And so one of the important things here is also figuring out, you know, what those security incidents are. So knowing what you need to identify. And so what you should include in your plan is how you're going to determine these deviations from the normal. Maybe you'll do research on white papers. Maybe you will monitor your network traffic over a month or so. Maybe you will use a combination of the both. But you know, you should figure out what that normal is, and you should figure out what exactly would trigger a incident response plan based on incidents. And so how will you identify when an incident is occurring? One perfect example is you could be using Wordfence, and the malware scanner indicates that a piece of malware has been found. That could trigger the very start of the incident response plan, where you have someone looking at the malicious file, determining if it's a false positive or not. At that point, then, you know, you move through the phases. Who do you notify if it's actually a malicious file? Do you contain it? Those sorts of things. So figuring out that first indicator of an incident is very important. And so you can use Wordfence, for example, for malware and vulnerability scanning, and you can get alerts for, you know, increased requests. You can get alerts for malicious files, all those good sorts of things. So that's something to keep in mind and make sure you have configured appropriately for your organization. And then you should also make sure that you're doing user monitoring. So watching when people are logging in, where they're logging in from, and making sure that those are coming from, you know, normal sources at normal times of the day. So like if Bob's on vacation and he logs in, his account logs in at, you know, 1 a.m. and you know they're on vacation without, you know, their work computer and such, then you know that's probably a security incident and you should trigger everything. So that would be one example of identifying an incident. I believe WP Activity Log provides user activity monitoring. Also, the Wordfence Live Traffic does that. So with security, you should have multiple layers. So make sure you have multiple layers when it comes to identifying things. You should also have network monitoring. So an intrusion detection system. It's going to be a little less common, you know, with just, you know, one WordPress site to need network intrusion detection systems. But if you have like a whole network and you manage it yourself, you're going to want to have those network intrusion detection systems so that you can see if, you know, someone's on your network and, you know, maybe browsing around. So you can cut off their access and such, which is going to be in the containment phase, which we'll talk about in a minute here. But that's important. And then WP Activity Log actually has a WordPress intrusion detection system kind of like guide so that you can set up their plugin to do that. So I highly recommend checking that out and configuring that so you have that detection system for WordPress. When people are logging in and such. Of course, Wordfence does that for you as well. You can set up the alerts to notify you when an administrator logs in or things like that. So I highly recommend going through the Wordfence settings and making sure those are configured correctly for your organization. And then make sure that you have logging enabled. This is incredibly important, not only for detecting intrusions and security incidents, but also for identifying, the root cause of these, which is important when it comes to the lessons learned phase, which we'll talk about later. So make sure you have logging enabled. And then you should do some sort of logging analysis, whether it be manual or automated. Manual, it would be a lot more time consuming, and you'd have to do it quite frequently to make sure that you're detecting things on a good time frame. But you can use tools to do that. One, for example, is Splunk. It's a really common one. It's a little more pricey, and it's not for just one WordPress site. But there's a lot of different open source options out there for you. I highly recommend researching them and seeing which one would be a good fit for your organization, since every organization is different. But yeah, make sure that you have logging enabled so that you can identify things, and logging analysis enabled. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ram?
Just that, this is, I kind of wanted to emphasize, and you mentioned this a bit, but, this is a good time to actually take a backup of, the current state of the site, because you do want to maybe do some forensic analysis. If you just delete the malware that got on your site, you might not have as easy of a time finding out how it got there. So,
Yeah, and if this is maybe your first time dealing with something like this, maybe you're just running a smaller membership or e-commerce site and you start deleting things immediately, and you kind of have that feeling you're going to have a team look at it. You're going to have to get it cleaned. Chloe, Ram, you've both worked in site cleaning in the past. You would like to see, the logs. You would like to see what happened on the site and potentially the malware itself, rather than, getting a site that's half cleaned. That's going to help with an intrusion vector there, right?
it's a lot easier to prevent stuff from happening again in the future if you have a better idea of how it happened in the first place. And having a snapshot of the site as it was post infection is super useful for that. Like, if you don't have the option to do it, then don't worry about it, but if you have the option, please do.
So we're moving into containment here. What else are we going to be doing in this phase?
So containment is the name of this phase originated from attacks on corporate networks, and the idea was to shut down the infected or compromised system's connectivity so that it couldn't be used to pivot further into your internal network. Now, I mean, this is still relevant for WordPress sites, and realistically, the NIST framework kind of groups identification, containment, and eradication together, because it's not like a one-way street. It's not like you identify, then you contain, then you eradicate. No, it's more like you might identify more stuff during containment or during eradication that makes you jump back to identification containment. Anyways, the most obvious example of this is where your WordPress site is hosted on like a DMZ on your internal network, which does happen, and you don't want that compromised WordPress site to lead to your Exchange server getting compromised. But it's much more likely that you might have an e-commerce site and you discover like a credit card skimmer on your checkout page. So containment in that case would be shutting down the checkout process and maybe putting the entire site in maintenance mode so that your customers don't have more information stolen from them. You don't want to leave the site running if there's a danger to your customers. Or, let's say your site's redirecting all visitors to malvertising sites. You definitely want to take your site down rather than leave it up like that, because that is going to impact your SEO and your reputation. So, containment, and this is one of those things where there's a little bit of overlap between this and eradication, but containment is ideally where you patch the entry point if you are able to identify it during the identification phase. If your site has a vulnerable plugin, this is where you update it or delete it. If your administrator has a weak password, this is where you change it, or any other passwords on your site that the attacker might have gained access to. Say if they've gained access to your users table, this is where you might realize, okay, yes, we need to disclose and tell our users to change their passwords. Like, you might not necessarily have to do the disclosure, but this is where you make a note to do that later. This is where you might change your WordPress configuration, your database password, and your salts and keys. And if there's an obvious way that the attacker got in, this is where you remove that so that they can't do any further damage. Like if they have an admin account, remove that account. And it's useful for the containment phase to know which applications or plugins are mission critical, to figure out the correct course of action during the containment phase. Do you just need to turn off the checkout process until you've got this figured out, or do you need to take the whole site offline completely? This is where you figure that out. So next is eradication, which I'll hand over to Chloe.
Yeah, so this one really closely aligns with the containment phase. You're doing a lot of, just right after containment, you're just making sure that everything has been eradicated or removed, and any traces of the threat or the attacker have been completely removed. So, if in the containment phase, instead of completely removing the attacker account and you just, demoted it to subscriber, which I wouldn't recommend doing, but if you did something like that, then this phase would be, deleting that account completely. Actually, now that I think about it, it might actually make sense to demote that account to no privileges at all. Just erase their WP capabilities and give them no capabilities, but keep the information for forensic analysis. But containment would be containing, and then eradication would be completely removing it. Hopefully you just take notes as you're going. So if you do remove that entire account, just take notes of, the time it was created, and those sorts of things. And so what you're doing here is, if a vulnerability was in a plugin that was the result of the incident, making sure that plugin is either up to date with a patched version that has no security vulnerability or is completely removed, making sure that all access is revoked, making sure that the system does not have, the malicious files still on it. So making sure all those malicious files have been removed. And so that sort of thing is happening in this phase, and just making sure everything is gone. And so if it was a file that was modified and you just contained it, then that would be restoring it back to its original state to make sure that it's been completely eradicated. Again, this one really closely aligns with the containment phase, so I think there's a lot of overlap there. And is there anything you want to add to that one, Ram?
We got a question from Will. How often do you want to change your database passwords in WordPress? And the truth is, most of the time, as long as you're using a strong password, you don't need to change it unless you have reason to think that it might have been compromised. But if there's any sign of intrusion on your site, like, I'm not just talking about your site being attacked, but any malware shows up, any unexpected administrators show up, anything like that, that's when you need to change your database password post haste. But you usually won't need to change it unless there's a security incident. But with that said, you should probably change it for any security incident.
Oh, yeah.
So, that leads us to our second to last phase. This is not the last phase, and a lot of people seem to think it is, but it really isn't. And that's phase 5, which is recovery. And that's bringing everything back to normal, or at least a new normal. So it involves restoring functionality, bringing offline systems back online. In a lot of cases, restoring from a known clean backup is the best way to eradicate malware or new malicious administrators, and it is very tempting to just skip directly to this step. And while it's true that it can save you from some time, you really want to do the identification and containment phases. Like restoring from a backup maybe lets you skip the eradication phase. It does not let you skip identification and containment. Because if there's a vulnerable plugin, guess what? You just restored that vulnerable plugin. If there's an admin user with a weak password and you change their password, hey, guess what? You just restored their old weak password that, attackers might have known. It's super important not to restore a compromised site to a vulnerable state without doing the remediation normally done in containment. Patch stuff, remove stuff that's vulnerable that can't be updated, change all your passwords. And, this is probably the part where you do disclosure to external stakeholders, customers, regulatory bodies, whatever you're required to do, or whatever would be a good idea to do, even if it's not required. Building trust with your customers is important as well. So yeah, recovery is a good time to do all of that. And that takes us to, honestly, like the first and last steps are the most important, but a lot of people skip the last step, and that is lessons learned. So Chloe, I will let you take this, because really, if you skip this step, you will have learned nothing.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most important steps. So basically, you don't know what happened if you don't know how to prevent this from happening again in the future if you don't know exactly what happened, and you don't know how to improve your incident response plan if you don't talk about the mistakes that were made during the process and everything. So the lessons learned phase is sitting down and taking a look at everything that's happened and figuring out what lessons you've learned from it. And something we didn't really mention is that throughout this entire incident response process, you should be taking notes throughout everything. So when you delete a file, what file are you deleting? Take note of when you deleted it, what file was deleted. Keep a copy of that file somewhere so you can analyze it. And so taking notes of things like that, where were the attackers, and any notes you can have, you should take notes throughout the entire process, and then you can use this in the lessons learned phase. One thing, for example, too, is how long did it take someone to respond? So what you're going to do in this phase is you're going to sit down and you're going to say, so how did we identify the problem? Were we quick enough? What can we do better so that we identify an incident quicker next time? You can figure out things like, why did the intrusion happen? So was it a vulnerable plugin? Okay, so if it was a vulnerable plugin that led to malware being installed on the site, what can we do in the future? So for example, if your current policy is to update a plugin every 5 days, and that was your policy and that's how you got hacked, maybe you review that policy and you say, okay, now we should make sure that we're reviewing the change logs and plugin changes as within a day instead of 5 days, so that we can prevent this from happening again in the future. So it's basically improving everything so that things will be better in the future, so that your incident response is better in the future, so that you'll have less incident response incidents in the future. And so that's why it's one of those really important phases, and it's really important that you don't skip over that. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Ram?
Just Chloe sort of cover this to some extent, but it is it's very tempting to only focus on the things that could have been done better technically. But a big part of why this is important is to figure out what processes you need to improve. And again, Chloe did cover this, but I just want to add extra emphasis to a big part of why this is valuable is what processes can you improve, what policies can you improve, since a lot of security is processes and policies. Mm-hmm. And if you focus only on the technical details, you'll be preparing for the last war and not the next one.
Yeah.
Les mentioned, and this is something we've touched on a few times, that disclosure creates, a lot of noise, and you got to be careful there because you need to be ready to manage the additional noise there after a disclosure. And, when you're being transparent, as we mentioned a few times here, you need to make sure that you have everything under control. You just talked about, going in, if it was a compromised password or multiple passwords that were compromised, you're going to want to make sure all of that's under control. But at the same point, you need to be transparent the whole way through the process, and you're not trying to just hide these issues.
Yeah, and I think it's also very important to be as explicit about what happened as you reasonably can without revealing sensitive internal information. If there was a data breach, don't tell your customers there was a data breach. Tell them what was breached. Was it just password hashes? Was it credit card numbers? Did it involve CVV codes? I really hope not, because then you're not PCI compliant. But what was compromised? What might have been compromised but you're not sure of? Be explicit, because the more explicit you are, the less awkward questions you'll have to answer after the fact.
See a lot of familiar names. We appreciate everybody stopping by and hanging out with us here. Susan, we got Chris here, Les, as I just mentioned, we appreciate it. Adam as well. Dave is here. We appreciate everybody stopping by. We're going to touch on the swag question in just a moment. But, while we were talking about some of these phases, Chloe, you were talking about identifying an issue and kind of setting a baseline. One thing that came to mind is, Wordfence offers a number of free features to help out here. You talked about the admin logins. You definitely want to make sure that you have those preferences set up. At the very least, a new administrator login from a different location. You mentioned, if somebody's on vacation in one area, you see a new login in Bangladesh where they're definitely not on vacation. That's something to take a look at. But you can also, if you're running multiple sites, get those set up on Central. That way, if you log in one day and you see that you have some critical issues all across the board on 10 or 15 sites, hopefully you're not hosting them on the same account. But that's going to tip you off to something there, and then you might be looking at backups. Let's take a look at our swag winners here. We may have a graphic. Our 5 winners: David, Carly, Pete, Jeremy, and Chris. You will be getting an email from us. Our swag question again. Let me look here, as I have lost the swag question. What could be classified as a security incident? Ram or Chloe, do you want to expand on that a little more? We've touched on it earlier in the show.
Basically say that anything that impacts confidentiality, availability, or integrity of your systems.
Yeah, so you've both worked in site cleaning previously, and we talked about the importance of having backups in place, ideally off-site. But, at what point would you be expecting a cleaning request to come in here? Chloe, you spent time on the cleaning team. If somebody is not comfortable cleaning things out, maybe they're not comfortable going in and changing their database password, maybe the extent of it is kind of just changing a user password, you're probably going to recommend a site cleaning, as soon as this incident is found and out of control, right?
Yeah, so probably right after the identification phase, you come to Wordfence, and we will help you with the containment, eradication, and what's the fourth one there? Recovery.
Recovery.
Yeah, recovery. So what we would do basically is we would take a backup of your site before we begin the cleaning, and then we take it offline and we work on it, clean it. We hope that you take the site offline so you don't infect, customers and such. So you have to have a little bit of a role in the containment phase. But then
and we help with lessons learned too.
Yeah,
we give suggestions.
We have a great report that we send over. Chloe, you've sent a number of those to customers, and they detail, what steps you need to take, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, changing your salts, changing your passwords. If you have the appropriate logging and everything in place, hopefully you do, we can, in some cases without logs, we can figure out, exactly how they got in. So, what you need to do in the future. So if it was a plugin vulnerability or whatnot, or a weak password, we help you understand why it happened so that you can learn from that experience and, take that forward and improve the security of your site and such. So really great service. And yeah, it helps with, most of the phases there.
Also, I can't believe I missed the soda discussion that was happening in the comments. And, we're discussing weird, various, gross orange-flavored sodas, and I can't believe anyone hasn't brought up Orangina, which is delicious.
I saw that discussion. I've been trying to not drink soda, so I was trying to keep it out of my mind there. It is making me want an orange crush, though, I will say. I was going to say, though, we're going to make it easy on you if you're a K through 12 school before something like this occurs. If you're with a K through 12 public school in the United States or elsewhere, we've recently expanded out of the United States for this. We're offering free site cleaning, site audit services from our cleaning and audit team. So if you suspect there's issues with the site, or even if there isn't and you just want to take a look or have us take a look, we have that offering for you, and we'll post a blog post there in the chat for you to check that out. If you know somebody who's involved in K through 12, that's an awesome service for them to stay ahead of anything that might come about. Chloe, Ram, we touched on a good bit there just with the phases alone. Anything else that we want to talk about other than soda right now?
I just want to say that, incident response is an entire discipline, and it's possible to, make your entire career just in doing incident response. So it's a mile wide, but it's also a mile deep. So, I don't expect anyone to be an expert at it, but I do think that it's really valuable to just have an idea of, what the phases are, because, it doesn't matter if, if you're doing this on a WordPress site. It doesn't matter if you're running operations at a large company. Even for just like, household emergencies, just having an idea, a framework of how to respond to incidents is really applicable to a lot of types of emergencies. And it's really useful to have an idea of where to start and how to plan for things.
Chloe, anything to add? You're the one that's always kind of trying to get hacked, and that's kind of what we were planning against today. You want to, you talked about logging and auditing. There's a few different plugins and software to use there. You just want to stay ahead of everything and know what is common for your site, right?
Yeah, and one thing to mention is, I try to get my site hacked. My hosting provider that I use for testing and stuff actually quarantines the files. So that's basically containment automatically. So that's something to keep in mind, picking out a hosting provider that can assist you in, incident management, maybe contain those files for you automatically, which is something to consider. That just came to my mind.
We appreciate the comments, Susan and Will and Les there. Side note, we are hiring. We have multiple roles open, defiant.com/employment. If you think you would be a good fit, or maybe you know somebody, we have an instructional designer position. We have a senior researcher for website performance. That's related to fast or slow, which if you haven't checked that out, go head over fastorslow.com and check your site speed out. Ram, is that 18 locations around the world?
Yep.
And that'll give you a good idea how your site's performing and what you need to work on. There's a lot of information on the site. We got senior operations security engineer with AWS there, QA engineer if you want to work alongside Ram and the rest of the team. And we also have some senior PHP developer roles open as well. I think that about covers it for now. We have been we got an image there. Love spending Tuesday evenings with the Wordfence. We appreciate you stopping by.
That looks nice.
Yes,
Yeah.
that does.
Oh
look
man, I
nice.
miss being outside in places that are like not burninating.
For those of you that may be new subscribers on our mailing list, or if you're not on our mailing list right now, go ahead and subscribe. We have a stream on Thursdays, which are for our new users to get you up to speed with the Wordfence plugin. We cover the Wordfence basics on that stream. So go ahead, wordfence.com, into the footer of the page. You can sign up for the mailing list there. You'll be the first to hear about new issues that we find. There's also a podcast link there to subscribe to the mailing list, and you'd be hearing from Ram quite a bit there, right?
Yeah, you should listen to our podcast. We cover like whatever interesting, crazy cybersecurity news happened that week, and other stuff like privacy, innovation, big WordPress changes, stuff like that. So, and of course the obligatory occasional cryptocurrency,
Yeah,
which is like apparently that's all podcasts have to occasionally mention it now. That's a rule now.
if you use Chrome, we'll be sure to keep you up to date with all of the security fixes that are released there as well. Last but not least, head over to Twitter at Wordfence. You can follow us to keep an eye out for what we post there. Again, we appreciate everybody stopping by. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will certainly catch you next Tuesday, same time, same place. Ram, Chloe, thanks for joining. It was really fun. Appreciate it. Until next time, right? We'll see you soon.
It's always a pleasure.
Bye-bye,
Thanks, everyone.
Wordfence. We have better hackers.